Listen here, you don't belong here." The voice cut through the noise like a blade, sharp and cold, echoing across the crowded terminal of JFK Airport. 1 second later, Ava Morgan's black leather suitcase was kicked hard, bursting open as documents and electronic devices scattered across the floor. The sound of things hitting the ground was swallowed by a chorus of gasps from horrified passengers. Caroline Pierce, the chief flight attendant of Aurora Air, stood there beneath the harsh overhead lights, her blonde hair gleaming her face, calm and proud, as if she had just done something righteous. She crossed her arms, lips curling into a smug smile. "Maybe next time you'll know your place." Ava said nothing. She bent down, collecting each paper, each device that had rolled away her fingers, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from holding back anger. Around her, the whispers rose like a wave. "Oh my God, who is she? Why would the flight attendant do that? Is someone recording this as every phone camera turned toward them?" Amid the chaos, Ava stood tall. She didn't shout, didn't argue. Only her eyes, dark, deep and cold, stared straight into Caroline's, a look that could have made anyone flinch if they had known who she really was. But Caroline didn't. All she saw was a woman of color, dressed elegantly, but not the right way, and to her that alone was wrong. Just minutes earlier, Ava had walked into Gate 27, with the calm poise of someone who had passed through thousands of airport lounges across the world. A grey suit, thin glasses, a small leather bag, everything about her was understated, elegant, effortless. No one knew that inside that briefcase lay a contract worth $500 million a deal that could redefine the entire aviation industry. No one knew that this woman was the CEO of Morgan Aero Safety Systems, the largest flight safety technology partner Aurora Air had ever signed. They only saw what they wanted to see, a woman who looked ordinary. And that was enough to judge her. Caroline Pierce, 34 years old, had worked for Aurora Air for nearly a decade. She believed first class was sacred ground, reserved for those who deserved it. In her mind, deserving meant white skin, bright suits, soft voices, and the kind of quiet authority that seemed inherited rather than earned. Not someone like Ava, with brown skin, sharp eyes, and a confidence that made Caroline feel threatened. She had sat through 6 diversity training sessions, but to Caroline, they were just hours trapped in a room, listening to people preach about equality. When Ava approached the boarding counter, Caroline had seen her from a distance, and something in her clicked. She stepped forward, smile glued to her face. "Good morning, ma'am. Are you sure you're in the correct line?" Her tone was sweet, but the venom was unmistakable. Ava handed over her ticket. Seat 2A. Caroline studied it longer than necessary, as though searching for a mistake. "Sometimes people get confused about their actual ticket class," she said loudly enough for others to hear. Curious eyes turned toward them. Ava smiled slightly. Not this time. That smile made Caroline's stomach tighten. Boarding began. Morning sunlight poured through the terminal glass, reflecting off the silver body of the A321 Neo. Ava stepped through the gate carrying her suitcase. She reached for the overhead compartment above seat 2A when Caroline stepped in front of her. "Excuse me," she said sharply, "that compartment's reserved for legitimate first-class passengers." She emphasized the word legitimate. Ava paused. Her voice was low but clear. "I am a legitimate passenger." Caroline moved closer, her cheap perfume mixing with the recycled air. "Maybe you should store your bag back there, where your kind usually sits." The air froze. From the first row, A middle-aged man looked up from his Wall Street journal. An elderly woman in row 3 covered her mouth in shock. Ava didn't react. She stared at Carolyn for one long second, then calmly adjusted her suitcase. That small, composed gesture felt like defiance. And then it happened. A violent kick, a loud thud. The suitcase hit the floor. The lid flew open, papers scattered across the aisle. Caroline straightened, tossing her hair back. "Next time, stay where you belong." In that instant, time seemed to slow. Ava knelt, gathering her documents with steady breaths. In her mind, she heard her father's voice. "Dignity isn't about what they call you. It's about what you answer to." She didn't answer. She just picked up each piece, one by one. But in her eyes burned a quiet fire, not of rage, but of promise. A promise that today the world would learn the true meaning of the word deserving. And only a few hours later, before the plane could even take off, Caroline Pierce would wish she had never spoken that first word. 30 minutes after the incident at the gate, the atmosphere inside the first-class cabin of Aurora Air Flight 1187 was thick like fog that refused to lift. Passengers who had just boarded stole quick glances toward the woman in seat 2A, then quickly looked away, pretending not to notice. No one spoke, but everyone knew what had happened. Caroline Pierce, however, was different. She stood at the front of the cabin, adjusting her neck scarf, as if the scene earlier had been nothing more than a small misunderstanding. Her hand trembled slightly, but her voice remained professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts. We'll be departing shortly." Ava Morgan sat upright, eyes fixed on the small round window beside her. Outside, the runway shimmered like silver under the sunlight. The reflection on her glasses hid the quiet storm forming inside. She was used to being judged. From boardrooms in New York to conferences in Berlin, skeptical eyes had always followed her. People were surprised to see a woman of color sitting at the head of the table, surprised that the name Morgan didn't come with the face they imagined. But Ava had stopped caring long ago, because she knew the greatest success wasn't sitting at the head of the table, it was making the entire room go silent just to listen to you. When the junior flight attendant Emily Chen approached with the drink cart, her voice trembled slightly. "Ma'am, would you like something to drink before takeoff?" Ava smiled faintly. "Just water, thank you." Emily nodded, but her eyes darted quickly toward Carolyn, the supervisor watching like a hawk. Ava noticed immediately, because that look of quiet fear had once been her own. 15 years earlier, Ava Morgan had been the youngest aerospace engineer in her company's research team. She had worked day and night not for fame, but because she believed flight safety shouldn't be a privilege, it should be a basic right. Back then, they had called her a quota hire, a diversity statistic, they said. But when her design saved 87 lives during the Denver incident, those voices went silent. From that day on, she learned one truth: the best way to answer prejudice is to make it irrelevant. The engines roared to life. The cabin vibrated softly. Caroline walked past, pretending to check seatbelts, though her eyes lingered on Ava with cold scrutiny. Ava felt the stare sharp, bitter, heavy. "Is there a problem, Miss Pierce?" she asked calmly. Caroline flinched. "None at all," she replied quickly, her voice stiff. "Good," Ava said, turning back to the window. The man seated beside her, Michael Grant, an investor from Chicago, leaned slightly toward her and murmured, "Some people don't realize who they're dealing with." Ava gave a faint smile. "I prefer it that way." As the plane began to taxi, Caroline stood at the front of the cabin, clutching the passenger manifest. Her eyes paused on the name Ava Morgan, Seat 2A. The name sounded familiar, but she couldn't remember from where. A faint unease crawled up her spine, the instinctive discomfort that comes when someone threatens your sense of power. Probably just another small VIP, she told herself, taking a deep breath. But something inside her wouldn't settle. In Seat 2. Ava opened her tablet, reviewing the presentation for the meeting in Seattle. The screen glowed with the title Aurora Air and Morgan Aero Safety Systems, Strategic Partnership Announcement. Beneath it a single number stood bold, $500 million, the value of the contract that would redefine flight safety across North America. She swiped the screen gently, then turned it off. It wasn't time to think about victory yet. A message from her assistant appeared, press already waiting at Seattle headquarters. Board expects you at 2 o'clock sharp. She tapped seen but didn't reply. Her mind was elsewhere on how a careless word, a dismissive look could still shrink the entire world into one small aching space. Emily returned, placing a glass of water on the tray. "Mom," she whispered, "I'm sorry about earlier at the gate." Ava looked up. She saw the young woman's hands trembling, but her eyes sincere. Ava smiled. "Don't be sorry for what you didn't do. Just don't let it happen around you again." Emily nodded a silent promise. Outside the window, the plane turned onto the runway, ready for takeoff. Inside, the silence was so complete you could almost hear the heartbeats of those pretending not to look at one another. At the front of the cabin, Carolyn adjusted her cap. Isatue Ava tightened her seatbelt. 2 women. 2 worlds. One believed power was meant to protect privilege. The other, knew true power, was meant to correct injustice. Flight 11. 87 began to move, but neither of them knew that just a few hours later, when the plane landed, one of them would never be allowed to fly again. Morning light spilled through the clouds, turning the first-class windows into mirrors, reflecting 2 faces, one cold as steel, the other calm as water. Caroline Pierce stood tall, the sunlight catching her cheekbones, making her Aurora Air badge gleam more like a small emblem of power she clung to. In Caroline's mind, everything she did was about maintaining standards. She had never once thought she was wrong. First class was her kingdom, and within it, she was the gatekeeper of the sky. Yet behind her polished professionalism were deep cracks. 6 diversity training sessions on her record 6 times, she sat still, smiling politely, leaving with the same thought echoing in her mind. They just want to make me feel guilty for being born in the right place. On her private social media, she shared posts like, "Hard work, not handouts," and "Earn your seat." To her success was the reward of effort, but that effort always came in the familiar form she understood, white, articulate, graceful, never making others uncomfortable by merely existing. Now, as she looked at Ava Morgan, sitting quietly in Seat 2, as something in her tightened, not because the passenger was loud or difficult, but because she was too calm, a kind of calm that made Caroline feel exposed. Who does she think she is? Caroline asked herself, though. Deep down, she had already decided on the answer. A privileged imposter, nothing more. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Brooks went through his pre-flight checklist. He had been flying for more than 20 years, long enough to see the aviation industry evolve, yet some things never changed the undercurrent of quiet prejudice that lingered in the air. He heard Caroline's voice over the intercom, sharper than usual. Daniel frowned. She had been warned before about her attitude toward passengers, yet she always escaped consequences, thanks to positive feedback from VIP clients. He sighed. There were some kinds of small power that made people believe they could play God. In the galley behind Emily, Chen stacked drink trays with trembling hands. She had seen the entire incident at the gate. She had wanted to speak up to say something to defend someone, but the words died in her throat. Rent payments, student loans, the subtle threats from Carolyn about how those who don't cooperate don't last long at Aurora. All of it kept her silent. She knew silence was a form of guilt, too. But here silence was survival. Meanwhile, in the front cabin, Ava Morgan remained unsettlingly composed. She opened a small notebook and began to write. Observation is the first stage of any reform. Her handwriting was sharp and precise, the kind of script belonging to someone used to making big decisions. She didn't write emotions, only facts, like an engineer analyzing data like a CEO conducting a live experiment. Caroline Pierce, senior flight attendant. Behavioral bias observed. Unchecked authority, likely systemic. She stopped, looked at the last line, then closed the notebook. A soft ding sounded, signaling cruising altitude. Caroline began her cabin check. When she reached the front row, she paused beside seat 2. Her voice sugar-sweet, but edged with mockery. "Mum, would you like to see our premium lunch options?" Or perhaps Ava looked up, her tone light yet steady. "No, thank you. I've already made my choice." Caroline narrowed her eyes, misreading the calmness as defiance. "Of course," she said with a smirk. "Some people do get confused with premium menus." A smile, a single line. But in that moment, the invisible cord of fate tightened another loop. From seat 1. B. Michael Grant lowered his newspaper, his eyes hard. Every word he'd overheard unsettled him, not because it was loud, but because it was happening here in first class, where he had paid nearly $2,000 for courtesy. He didn't know who the woman in 2A was, but he knew this. If he stayed silent, he was complicit. The plane glided smoothly through the clouds, yet the air inside grew heavier by the minute. Caroline didn't know that far below at Aurora Air's headquarters, an important meeting was about to begin, one where the name Ava Morgan sat at the top of a $500 million partnership contract. One phone call, one confirmation, and the empire Caroline thought she was guarding would no longer belong to her. Ava leaned back in her seat, eyes half closed, listening to the steady rhythm of the engines, like the heartbeat of her own restraint. In her mind, Caroline's image faded, replaced by the faces of hundreds like her, the gatekeepers of the world, the ones who believed power meant keeping others out. But Ava knew the truth. The real gate was never in their hands. It belonged to those patient enough not to kick it down, but to wait until the wind quieted and open it from within. At 30,000 feet beneath a sky of perfect blue, a storm was forming. Not outside the plane, but within the very system that had taught Caroline Pierce to believe she was untouchable. The soft chime signaled that the cabin had reached cruising altitude. In the first-class section of Aurora Air Flight 1187. The light was gentle, filtered through a thin veil of clouds. The peace felt artificial, like the still surface of a lake just before a storm breaks. Caroline Pierce adjusted her service tray and glanced once more at the passenger list. The name Ava Morgan, seat 2A, sat there neat and unbothered like a silent challenge. She didn't know why that name irritated her so much, only that it did. During 7 years of service, Caroline had attended to hundreds of important people. From pharmaceutical CEOs to members of Congress, she had mastered the art of smiling at the right moment speaking with the right tone. But Ava was different. The way that woman sat quietly reading her documents without acknowledging anyone made Carolyn feel invisible. And no one was allowed to make her feel invisible in her own domain. She walked toward seat 2A, the tray trembling slightly in her hands, not from exhaustion, but from restrained anger. On the tray sat a perfectly seared steak, a slice of golden bread, and a glass of red wine glowing under the dim cabin lights. These were the standards for every first-class passenger, but Caroline stopped her smile sharp as a blade. "Mum, I'm sorry," she said sweetly. "Your pre-ordered meal seems to be unavailable. We only have a cold chicken sandwich and water left." The cabin fell silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the engines outside. Ava looked up her dark eyes, meeting Caroline's gaze. "Unavailable?" she asked, her voice calm, almost too calm. "I pre-ordered last week. I have confirmation by email." Caroline shrugged her gaze, sliding downward, in a way that felt more like scrutiny than apology. System glitch, maybe. Happens all the time. Then she placed the cold tray on Ava's table and turned away without a word of regret. Everything inside Ava froze, not because of the food, but because of the contempt disguised as professionalism. From the row ahead, Michael Grant glanced back. He saw the glass of water, the limp sandwich, sitting lonely on the silver tray. And he saw the woman in seat 2, the one who carried herself like a leader, sitting perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't defeated, but she wasn't reacting either. Ava took a slow breath. In her mind, a memory rose the day she was 20, walking into her first interview at the Houston Aerospace Center. She had worn an old suit and was stopped at the lobby because she didn't look like an engineer. That day she said only one thing: "Give me 10 minutes inside, and I'll prove I am." 10 minutes later, her emergency design proposal made the entire board rise to their feet. From that moment, she understood some doors don't open with keys, but with courage. And today, Caroline Pierce had just rebuilt that same door for her to walk through again. Caroline returned to the galley, her heart pounding with a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. She saw Emily Chen quietly arranging drinks like a shadow in the background. "Chen," she called, "remember the passenger in 2A. Give her economy snacks if she asks for anything else. She's not special." Emily looked up, wanting to say something, but Caroline's glare made her swallow the words. "Yes, Mum," she whispered. Up front, Ava still sat, quietly staring at the cold meal, her eyes slowly closing. She wasn't angry. She was observing silently but sharply. In her world, every action, no matter how small, was data. She noted the way Caroline tilted her head, the way Emily lowered her eyes, the way everyone else stayed silent. Every detail would become a piece of the picture she was drawing, the true picture of this system. Caroline passed by again, stealing a glance at Ava, still composed. The calm only fueled her irritation. She couldn't stand people who didn't react, people who seemed too high above to care. Leaning closer, she whispered just loud enough for the front row to hear, "Some people just don't understand that money can't buy class." Michael Grant's head snapped up from his seat. "Excuse me, what did you just say?" Caroline froze but quickly forced a smile. "Oh, nothing, sir. Just a misunderstanding." Ava set her glass down on the tray, her eyes lifting toward the cabin door, not angry, not resentful, but filled with a chilling clarity. She knew this wasn't a battle between two women. It was a battle between dignity and prejudice, and she would not let silence win again. The flight continued smoothly through the sky as if nothing had happened. But in Seat 2A, a truth was being recorded every glance, every word, so that in just a few hours when the plane touched down, nothing in this cabin or in this company would ever be the same again. The sharp click of high heels echoed through the first-class cabin, each step striking the floor like metal against steel. Caroline Pierce approached a passenger manifest in her hand, but she wasn't really checking anything. Her eyes locked on Ava Morgan, the woman sitting calmly before a tray of untouched cold food. Her lips slightly curved her gaze, cutting through every layer of pretense in the world. That silence drove Caroline insane. She couldn't stand being ignored, couldn't bear those eyes that didn't fight back, but seemed to see through her, to judge her, and forgive her all at once. Inside, Caroline irritation had already turned into a storm. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carefully controlled, though it trembled faintly at the end. Ava looked up, her tone gentle. "Yes." Caroline drew in a breath, searching for an excuse. "Your bag seems too large for the overhead bin. For safety reasons, it should be stored in the rear compartment." She didn't bother to check, didn't need to. Everyone in the cabin could see that the black leather suitcase fit perfectly in its space, just like every other bag. Ava met her gaze, not angry, just slightly tilting her head. "This bag contains prototypes and confidential documents. I'd prefer to keep it nearby." Caroline raised an eyebrow, a thin smile slicing across her face. "Rules are rules. I'm afraid your kind doesn't get exceptions." The cabin went dead silent. The words struck like a slap in the face. From the front row, Michael Grant lowered his Wall Street Journal. "Ma'am, that's unnecessary," he said, his voice low but firm. Caroline turned sharply, eyes flashing with indignation. "So please let me handle this. We have security protocols for suspicious passengers." Ava's hand tightened around the armrest. "Suspicious," Caroline replied, slowly savoring the word. "We've had credit card fraud cases recently. You'd be surprised how often people borrow other identities to sneak into premium cabins." A few passengers turned their heads. Emily Chen stood frozen at the galley, her face pale as paper. She knew Caroline had crossed a line, but fear pinned her to the spot. "Enough," Michael said, standing up fully. She showed her ticket. "She has every right to be here." Caroline let out a mocking laugh. "And you must be very generous, sir, to assume everyone belongs." Ava set her glass down on the tray, her voice calm but cutting clear through the air. "I've had enough of this conversation. Please bring your supervisor." Caroline's tone hardened. "I am the supervisor." Then she stepped closer, so close that the smell of cheap perfume and her hot, uneven breath brushed against Ava's face. And then it happened. A violent kick, a loud thud filled the air. The black leather suitcase burst open, tumbling to the floor as the latch snapped. Technical documents and electronic components scattered across the aisle. The sound was sharp, clean, like a blade slicing through silence. "Maybe next time you'll remember your place," Caroline muttered, her voice low but loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. A woman in seat 3. A gasped softly. "Oh my God!" Another passenger raised a phone, hitting record. Michael stood frozen, disbelief written all over his face. Emily Chen rushed forward, her voice shaking. "Miss Pierce, please, step back." "Chen." Caroline snapped, her composure unraveling. Her pulse pounded, her heart racing, as if the entire world had turned against the control she had always believed belonged to her. Ava knelt down, gathering her papers one by one. Blueprints of aircraft safety systems lay scattered around her. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of holding in the fury burning beneath her skin. She knew every action, every word now would be remembered, not just by the phone's recording, but by history itself. "Mum, please let me help, Michael," said, bending down. Ava shook her head. "Thank you. I can handle it." She rose, straightened her blazer, fastened her cuff. Every movement was measured and deliberate, as if she were recalibrating an aircraft before takeoff. She looked directly at Caroline, her voice even low and as sharp as polished steel. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." Caroline forced a laugh, pretending to stay composed. "Oh, really?" Over a bag, Ava didn't blink. "No. Over your words." The silence that followed was heavy final. No one spoke. But everyone in that cabin knew something irreversible had just happened. Outside, the sky stretched wide and serene, but inside seat 2A a fire had been lit. A fire no wind in this world could ever extinguish. The first sound to break the silence was the soft drop of a fountain pen, an almost absurdly small noise compared to the storm rising within the first-class cabin. A few passengers had already taken out their phones. Camera lenses glinted. No one spoke, but everyone knew this was no longer a minor incident. Caroline Pierce stood frozen, her heart racing. She hadn't realized she'd gone too far until she saw the faces around her. Shock, disgust, and fear. No one stood with her. Not one person. But instinct made Caroline cling to her last line of defense, the illusion of authority. She grabbed her radio, her voice trembling but trying to sound steady. "Security to gate 27. Code yellow. Possible fraud and non-compliance case." "What are you doing?" Michael Grant demanded, rising from his seat. Calling for backup, Caroline replied, glancing toward Ava. "For everyone's safety." "Safety?" Michael shot back, his tone cutting with disbelief. "That woman hasn't done a thing except get humiliated." Caroline spun around. "So please remain seated. I'm handling a security situation." Her words poured fuel onto the fire. A small ding came from the intercom, followed by Captain Daniel Brooks's calm but weighted voice. "Cabin crew report status." Caroline snatched the radio. "Captain passenger in 2A showing aggressive behavior. Possible identity fraud. Request security intervention." Ava Morgan didn't move. She sat still, hands resting on her lap, her gaze unwavering. The anger inside her had already passed. What remained was a kind of silence, the quiet strength of someone who knew where real power came from. In her mind, her father's old words resurfaced. "When others think they're controlling the story, let them talk until they reveal themselves." So she didn't argue. She didn't resist. She simply let Caroline reveal herself. 3 minutes later, 2 airport security officers entered the cabin. Officer Andre Lewis, broad-shouldered and calm, and Officer Karen Patel, sharp-eyed and steady in her stride. "Good afternoon, folks," Lewis said, his deep voice, firm but polite. What seems to be the issue? Caroline stepped forward like a hero waiting for applause. "Officers, this passenger's documents appear fraudulent." She became hostile when asked to comply with safety protocol. Ava remained seated. She quietly opened her bag, took out her wallet, and spoke with remarkable composure. "Here are my ID and boarding pass." Lewis examined them, his expression shifting as he checked each detail. Everything was valid. Name, ticket number, reservation code, Titan level membership card, perfectly in order. "Everything looks fine here, ma'am," he said, handing them back. Caroline interjected quickly. "Appearances can be deceiving. People like her know how to fake it." A ripple of outrage spread among the passengers. The elderly woman in seat 3A stood up. "She didn't do anything wrong. You kicked her bag. Please stay out of this, ma'am." Caroline snapped her voice, cracking. "Stay out!" The woman shot back. "No, I won't stand by and watch someone be humiliated just because of her skin color." Emily Chen, her hands trembling, stepped forward from the galley. Her voice was soft but clear. I saw it too. She didn't do anything. Miss Pierce kicked her luggage and said things. Caroline turned sharply. "Emily, be careful with what you're implying." But this time, Emily didn't lower her head. "I'm not implying anything. I'm telling the truth." The air thickened like fog. Officer Lewis turned toward Caroline, his tone dropping. "Ma'am, unless you can provide actual evidence of fraud, I'll have to file this as a harassment complaint instead." Caroline opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Cold sweat traced the back of her neck. Ava rose from her seat. Her grey blazer crisp, her expression unreadable. "Officers," she said slowly, each word deliberate. "I'll cooperate with any procedure you find necessary. But I will also be filing a report formally with Aurora Air." Lewis nodded. "Understood, ma'am." Then he turned to Caroline, his voice no longer polite. "You may want to call your supervisor. You're not in charge of this situation anymore." Caroline took a step back, as if stripped of the final layer of power she had been hiding behind. She felt small, lost, standing inside the very cabin she had once ruled like a kingdom. Meanwhile, Ava returned to her seat and picked up her phone. The screen glowed with messages from her assistant board, waiting. "Press conference in 2 hours. Aurora's PR team confirming your attendance." Her eyes landed on the words, "Aurora Air Partnership, $500 million contract." She exhaled softly. Then it hit her like a flash of lightning, the realization that her company, Morgan Aero Safety Systems, was Aurora Air's official flight safety partner. And the woman who had just humiliated her was an employee of that very airline. The corner of Ava's mouth curved slightly. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but of clarity, of someone who had just seen the full shape of the chessboard. Outside, the sky remained calm white clouds, drifting lazily across the blue. But beneath that serenity, a storm was forming, not a storm of emotion, but of truth. And when it finally broke, no one in this cabin would be standing in the same place again. No one in the first-class cabin spoke another word. No one even dared to breathe too loudly. Only the steady hum of the engines filled the air like the cold mechanical heartbeat of the aircraft, slicing through the clouds, an aircraft that Ava Morgan herself had helped design. She sat still, watching the phone in her hand blink repeatedly. On the screen, a notification glowed, Aurora Air Headquarters, board call incoming. She inhaled deeply, then pressed accept. "Good morning, Richard," she said, her tone calm and composed. On the other end, a man's voice came fast and urgent. "Ava, are you airborne? The press is setting up in Seattle. We'll need your statement about the $500 million partnership with Aurora Air before 2 o'clock. The cabin froze. 500 million! Each word dropped like thunder in the thick silence. Caroline Pierce, still standing near the front, went rigid. Her heart skipped a beat. Her hand clenched the passenger list so tightly that the paper crumpled. The name Ava Morgan was still printed there, the same name that now burned like a verdict. Ava continued speaking into the phone, her voice steady and clear. "Yes. I'll address the media once we land. Aurora's CEO should be ready to confirm the integration timeline. Safety systems are ready for Phase 1 deployment." Whispers rippled through the cabin. Michael Grant straightened in his seat, eyes wide. Wait, Morgan Aero Safety. You're the Ava turned toward him, her lips curving into a faint, thread-like smile. Yes, I am. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Brooks heard the conversation through the internal audio feed. His hand froze on the control lever. A jolt of shock shot down his spine. He flipped open the passenger manifest and read the name again. Ava Morgan. Seat 2A. His heartbeat quickened. There was no mistake. The woman sitting in first class was the CEO of the company that built the safety systems for every aircraft in Aurora Air's fleet. A strategic partner. Someone who could either secure or dismantle the airline's future with a single phone call. He pressed the intercom button. Miss Pierce, please come to the cockpit immediately. Caroline entered her face, pale as ash. Captain Brooks turned to her, his eyes heavy with anger and disappointment. Do you have any idea who you just harassed? His voice was low, but it struck like steel. Caroline's mouth opened, but no words came. That woman, was she? She's Ava Morgan, he cut her off. CEO of Morgan Aero Safety, the company that designed the systems keeping this plane in the air. Caroline stumbled backward, grabbing the doorframe for support. She wanted to say, I didn't know, but even in her mind, the excuse felt hollow. Not knowing meant she had treated anyone who didn't look the way she expected as lesser. In first class, Ava ended the call, set her phone down on the tray and looked around. She didn't speak, but her gaze was enough to draw the entire cabin into silence. She knew this moment would be remembered not for the drama, but for what it revealed about true power. Power didn't need to shout. It didn't need to punish. Real power was when people realized they were wrong before she had to say a single word. Caroline returned to the cabin, her face ghost white, every eye turned toward her. Michael Grant looked at her not with anger but with pity. The elderly woman in seat 3A shook her head softly and murmured, Justice has a way of flying back around. Emily Chen avoided Caroline's eyes, but her hands were clenched tightly, as if gathering the courage never to bow again. Caroline stepped toward seat 2A, her voice trembling. Miss Morgan, I didn't realize. Ava looked up, her eyes calm yet unwavering. Of course you didn't. The words were barely more than a breath, but they hit harder than any shout. Miss Morgan, please, Caroline stammered. If I had known, Ava interrupted, her tone as even as ever. That's exactly the problem, Miss Pierce. It shouldn't take knowing who someone is to treat them with respect. Each word landed like a hammer strike. There was no yelling, no rage, just the truth, spoken in a voice too calm to argue with. Caroline stood there, tears filling her eyes, but no one felt sympathy anymore. Everyone knew that this moment, every look, every word was being recorded, and once the plane's wheels touched down in Seattle, the world would see it all on a screen, far larger than the sky outside. Ava Morgan turned back to her seat, picked up her phone, and opened her notes app. She typed a single line, Aurora Air, Incident Flight 1187. Initiate full review after landing. She closed her phone and shut her eyes. Not to rest, but to wait. The storm was about to touch the ground. Outside the window, Seattle emerged beneath a blanket of silver clouds, a city about to receive a flight, carrying justice itself. And when the wheels finally met the runway, Caroline Pierce's world would begin its free fall. The first-class cabin was so silent, it felt as if every breath was waiting for a verdict to be announced. Caroline Pierce stood frozen, the upper half of her body stiff as stone. Sunlight slanted through the window, casting a sharp glow across her face and revealing the beads of sweat sliding down her skin. In her trembling hand, the Aurora Air badge gleamed, a tiny symbol of authority she had once abused, now turned into evidence against her. "Miss Pierce." The voice of Captain Daniel Brooks came through the intercom, steady and cold. "Report to the cockpit immediately." Caroline swallowed hard. Her footsteps were heavy as she walked down the aisle, each step feeling like a descent into an abyss. The cockpit door closed behind her, and there waiting was Captain Brooks, his eyes filled with the weight of a man who had spent his life upholding discipline only to confront a moral failure within his own ranks. "Do you realize what you've done?" he asked, his deep voice striking like thunder. Caroline tried to defend herself, her voice trembling. "Sir, I didn't know who she was." "I was just following protocol." "Protocol," Brooks repeated, his eyes sharp as blades. "Which part of the protocol tells you to kick a passenger's luggage and insult her race?" Caroline said nothing. The sound of the ticking clock filled the cockpit each second, stretching like a sentence being served. Miss Pierce Brooks continued, "Do you even understand who you just insulted?" She shook her head faintly, her voice cracking. I know now." Brooks turned away, speaking low but clear. "She's not just a CEO. She's our CEO's business partner, the woman whose company literally builds the systems keeping us alive in this sky." In the cabin, Ava Morgan remained seated in 2A. She said nothing, her eyes fixed forward, as though watching a play whose ending she already knew. But inside her, her heartbeat quickened, not from triumph, but from an old ache. The ache of knowing that no matter how high she climbed, prejudice always found a way to reach up and pull her back down. Her fingers brushed the Morgan Aerosafety logo, engraved on the pen, clipped to her jacket. She tightened her grip, not out of anger, but to steady the balance between compassion and justice. The cockpit door opened. Caroline stepped out, her face pale as chalk. Behind her came Captain Brooks, his gaze locked on Ava. He stopped in the middle of the cabin and spoke clearly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing an operational delay. Our airline maintains a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. Effective immediately, Miss Pierce is relieved of duty." A wave of whispers swept through the cabin. Emily Chen covered her mouth on the verge of tears. Michael Grant nodded slightly and murmured to the passenger beside him, "About damn time." Caroline turned toward Ava, her voice breaking. "Miss Morgan, please, I made a mistake." "I didn't mean," Ava lifted her head, her eyes calm and deep as still water. "Miss Pierce, mistakes are when you spill coffee, not when you humiliate another human being." Tears rolled down Caroline's cheeks, streaking through her smeared makeup. She opened her mouth to speak, but Brooks cut her off. "Remove your wings, Miss Pierce." The cabin froze again. Caroline's shaking hand reached for the silver wings pinned to her uniform, the symbol she had worn proudly for 8 years. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp until it came loose and fell to the floor with a sharp, metallic clink. She bent to pick it up, but Brooks's voice stopped her cold. "Leave it. You've done enough." Silence lingered like smoke. Finally, Caroline turned toward Ava, her voice hoarse. "I'm sorry. I truly am." Ava met her gaze, not with hatred, but with quiet sadness. "I believe you're sorry. I just hope one day you'll also understand why you should be." The cabin door opened, and 2 airport security officers stepped in, Lewis and Patel. Miss Pierce Officer Lewis said, gently but firmly, "You'll need to deplane with us. Corporate HR will contact you regarding next steps." Caroline nodded, offering no resistance. She walked slowly down the aisle, each step echoing with the sound of a past unraveling. The passengers watched in silence as she left. Emily Chen bowed her head, tears slipping down, not just from pity, but because she knew this moment had changed her life. When the door closed, Captain Brooks turned back to the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We'll be departing shortly with our new lead attendant, Miss Emily Chen." The cabin filled with soft applause, not loud but meaningful. Ava smiled faintly, not from satisfaction, but from the quiet relief that justice had been restored, at least in this small cabin suspended between heaven and earth. Outside, the clouds were still white, the sky still blue. But inside, a new chapter had begun, one where compassion was no longer a weakness, but the truest measure of real power. Aurora Air Flight 1187 touched down on the Seattle runway beneath a fiery red sunset. The sound of the landing gear striking the ground echoed like the final stamp of fate sealing its verdict. When the plane came to a stop, the entire first-class cabin fell into silence, a silence no longer heavy with tension, but thick with realization. Caroline Pierce was gone. Only the empty seats remained, the faint trace of cheap perfume lingering in the air like a wrinkle in memory that refused to fade. Ava Morgan sat still, her seatbelt still fastened, her gaze fixed out the window, where the last light of day spilled across the silver wing, glimmering like a quiet reminder: a day can end, but justice does not. Her phone vibrated non-stop. Calls came in from Aurora Air Headquarters, from the press, from the board of Morgan Aerosafety. She accepted one. The voice of Aurora's CEO, Michael Thompson, came through quick and shaken. "Miss Morgan, I just received the report. I can't believe what happened on our aircraft. Please allow me to apologize personally." Ava closed her eyes. Her voice was calm, low, but every word struck like a bell against the conscience. "Michael, an apology can't fix what your system allowed to happen. What I experienced wasn't an isolated act. It was a reflection of your culture." Silence followed on the other end. Then came a trembling voice. "You're right. We'll take immediate action. Please tell me what you need from us." Ava opened her eyes, staring out at the runway lights, flickering like the glowing veins of the city. "Start with accountability," she said. Not just for one person, for the system that let her believe she could act that way. The news spread faster than the jet that had just landed. By the time Ava left the airport, the hashtag first class, while black and female, had reached the top of every social media trend. The video showing Caroline kicking the suitcase, shouting, and being escorted away by security flooded every platform. The comments poured in. She stayed calm like a queen. This is what grace under fire looks like. How many times does this happen when no cameras rolling? The media called it the flight that changed the sky. The next morning, at Aurora Air's Seattle headquarters, the 32nd floor boardroom was packed. On the giant screen was a still image of Ava Morgan in the cabin, her calm, steady gaze glowing amid the chaos. CIO Michael Thompson stood to speak, his voice heavy with shame. "We failed her. We failed our passengers. And we failed the principles we claim to stand for." He announced the immediate termination of Caroline Pierce, the suspension of the entire HR supervisory team, and the launch of an 8-year internal audit on systemic discrimination. He also unveiled a new partnership with Morgan Aerosafety, an initiative called Operation Horizon, a program to rebuild corporate culture and reform ethics training across the aviation industry. Later that day, at a press conference, Ava Morgan stepped up to the podium. Cameras flashed across the room, but she opened with only one line. "I didn't come here for revenge. I came here for change." The entire hall went silent. She recounted the incident, plainly, truthfully, without exaggeration, then paused, letting her gaze sweep across the rows of cameras pointed her way. Today it was me. Tomorrow it could be someone without the power to speak up. And that's why we're here, not to punish, but to rebuild. The applause that followed was not loud, but deep, a wave of understanding that this moment would be remembered not as a scandal, but as a lesson written into the future of business ethics and human dignity. That same afternoon, Emily Chen received an email from Human Resources. Effective immediately, you are promoted to lead flight attendant for exemplary integrity and professionalism. She burst into tears in her small Seattle apartment, clutching her phone to her chest. The same hands that had trembled with fear the day before now held steady, grasping a brand new chapter of her life. Night fell. Ava returned to her hotel room. She placed the black suitcase, the one that had been kicked, on the table. The small scratch on the leather was still there. She ran her fingers over it gently, not to erase it, but to remember. Because every scar is evidence, and every piece of evidence is a lesson for a world still learning how to respect what should have been obvious all along. Across the city, the airport lights glowed. Another Aurora Air flight took off, carrying new passengers, new lessons, and the quiet belief that while no one can rewrite the past, everyone can choose to fly better in the future. A year had passed since Flight 1187. The world of aviation had changed, not loudly, not dramatically like in the days when the scandal first broke, but quietly, deeply, like a storm that clears the sky only after sweeping away every trace of dust. At the top floor of the glass tower that housed Morgan Aero Safety, Ava Morgan stood before the wide window, gazing down at the Seattle runway, stretching beneath the morning sun. An Aurora Air jet had just taken off, leaving a thin white trail behind it, like the signature of destiny across a blue canvas. She smiled. Not the smile of victory, but the smile of someone who had witnessed justice take root. On her desk lay an open newspaper. The headline read, "The Hayes Act, passed new federal law enforces anti-discrimination standards in aviation." Ava turned the page and saw her own image captured as she addressed Congress. In that moment, she had not spoken for a company, but for millions of passengers who had once been mistreated in silence, with no voice to defend themselves. She remembered the night Congress voted. The golden light of the Capitol spilled across the faces of those who had walked beside her, Emily Chen, now the head of service training at Aurora Air. Captain Brooks, who had written the letter of support for the bill, and hundreds of airline employees raising their hands to pledge that service is not just convenience, it is dignity. Ava once believed justice came from courtrooms, but now she understood that true justice begins when people choose to change the way they see one another. In the small office next door, Emily Chen entered, carrying a fresh stack of reports. "Miss Morgan, the Foundation's quarterly report just came in," she said, smiling brightly. On the first page, the headline read, "Hayes Foundation for Transportation Equity, 312 discrimination cases, resolved 128 successful mediations." Ava read it, nodded softly, and said, "Good. Every case closed is one step closer to fairness." Emily hesitated, then spoke quietly. "I still think about that day. Sometimes the way you stayed, calm the way you looked at her. It changed how I see courage." Ava smiled, her expression gentle. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Emily. It's what you do, while fear is still sitting right beside you. That afternoon, Ava appeared on stage at the National Civil Rights Conference. Her black hair was neatly tied back, her voice echoing through the silent hall. That day, I was told I didn't belong in first class. But the truth is, dignity doesn't come with a seat number. It comes with how you carry yourself when the world tells you to move. Thousands rose in applause. In the audience, Emily Chen wiped her tears. At the far corner, a middle-aged man, Michael Grant, the investor from seat 1B, stood hand over heart. No one had forgotten that he was the first to speak up the spark that had ignited a quiet rebellion in the sky a year before. When the ceremony ended, Ava stepped into the corridor. Her phone lit up with a message from Michael Thompson, the CEO of Aurora Air. Aurora Air now ranks #1 in passenger satisfaction for inclusivity. Thank you, Ava, for reminding us who we fly for. She looked at the message for a long moment. A year ago, he had called her in desperation. Today, he called in gratitude. That was the difference between apology and awakening. Late that night, Ava returned home and opened the cabinet where her old black suitcase was stored. The small scratch on its surface was still there. She hadn't repaired it. She hadn't replaced it, because it had become a mark not only of humiliation, but of rebirth. She placed the suitcase on her desk and attached a new tag to the corner, Flight 1187. The day dignity took off. Then she looked out the window, where trails of airplane lights painted across the night sky like memories still in motion. Outside, the radio played the voice of a female reporter. Since the viral incident last year, the Hayes Foundation has trained over 10,000 airline staff worldwide. Industry leaders are calling it a cultural takeoff. Ava closed her eyes and whispered softly, "Not cultural human." And so the story that had begun with a single kick ended with a takeoff, not just for one woman, but for an entire generation that believed justice could soar higher than prejudice. Because in every sky, dignity remains the one thing that will never fall. From the perspective of a scholar in leadership culture and professional ethics, Ava Morgan's journey is not merely the story of a single flight. It is a mirror reflecting an entire society, one where status, skin color, or even a seat number can still make people forget the true worth of a human being. But Ava didn't choose anger. She chose dignity, because power can make others fear you, but only integrity can make them respect you. It was her calmness, not her authority, that forced an entire system to look inward and realize that service is not just about smiling at customers, but about seeing the human being in every passenger who walks through the airplane door. If you believe that justice doesn't need noise-only persistence, if you believe that how we treat the powerless defines who we truly are, then, like this video to share that message. Subscribe so you won't miss the stories where compassion is tested by prejudice. And before you leave, drop a comment, just one short phrase, but one that carries your belief in what's right. Hold your dignity. Because sometimes, true strength isn't about flying higher than others. It's about keeping your heart steady, even when you're suspended between the clouds of power and temptation.